Welcome to the Campfire Academy. I'm Andrew Craissati. Today we're talking about enabling investor relations for the retail investor.
So why is engagement with retail investors becoming more important for listed companies?
Why do we care about the retail investor? Are they more important than they used to be? Well, the answer to that is yes. With the changes in the regulatory framework for investing in publicly quoted companies, and with the abundance of information that is now openly available to the retail investor, there is an increase in the demand from the retail investor to buy more securities than was previously the case. So the balance in a public company's register of shareholders between institutional shareholders and retail shareholders is changing. And there are many reasons for that. But one of the reasons also is that retail investors are often increasingly viewed as contributors to the liquidity in the shares of public companies. Retail investors can often be thought of as short-term investors, and as a result, they drive up the volatility or the demand for shares in a public company. So they play a real role. And now that regulation and legislation is allowing them to become a more important category of investor, so the financial markets are much more opening up their strategies to allow the retail investor to come in and purchase securities.
What's changed in how retail investors consume information or make decisions today?
So the retail investor of today has changed from before. Firstly, in terms of how they consume information, and then secondly, effectively how they make decisions on what to invest in. So retail investors, firstly, now have alternatives in terms of channels through which they can invest. So there is an abundance of platforms, principally online, that are designed for the general public and that allow you to select shares you want to buy and then purchase them. That was much harder to do previously, and the only way you could do it in the old days was to go to your stockbroker and have the stockbroker execute an order to buy shares on your behalf. That is gone. The cost of stockbrokers to the retail investor, therefore, has largely gone. And instead, retail investors are finding it more affordable to buy publicly quoted shares. The decision-making process is more straightforward for the retail investor because they now have an abundance of information that is not just readily available, but it's presented in a manner that is easy to consume and easy to understand. So the investor today, if they are of a retail form, is much better informed and much more capable of making a well-educated decision. So all of this is largely driven by the flow of information. And that flow of information has really come about because of the change of legislation and how platforms are now intentionally creating investment opportunities for the retail investor. So information is being aggregated about public companies. It is being turned into easy to use, easy to manage information. You can effectively shop for publicly available shares through these platforms, and all in one place. You can therefore research, decide, purchase, sell, and track everything within your account. And that would not have been possible 20, 30 years ago, and it's all through the creation of these new online platforms.
How can companies adapt their IR approach to reach both an institutional and retail audiences effectively?
So if you are a publicly quoted company or organization, you're going to be starting to adapt your IR approach if you haven't already, and so as to cater to both communities of institutional and retail audiences. They are different audiences. They access information in different ways, and you therefore need to be understanding of the different platforms that are available to reach those communities. A lot of public companies will work directly with institutional investors, particularly if they're of a certain size. And irrespective of whether the investor base is institutional or retail, the companies do all share one thing in common, which is they have to communicate with that audience and they need to provide them with the same information. So a public company cannot provide information that details one set of data points to the retail investors and then give different information to institutional investors. Everybody is entitled to receive the same information and the same quality of information. So you need to have platforms that allow you to distribute your information and your content that is agnostic and that is openly accessible by any type of investor. That's where a platform like Campfire is very valuable, because it tracks the behavior of every investor, whether they are a retail day trader or whether they are the world's largest fund manager in Wall Street. And you can track the behavior of each individual investor, no matter who they are, where they live, or their size or sophistication.
What role does audio play in making updates more approachable for retail investors?
So for a long time now, one of the great challenges that has been faced by public companies talking to the retail investor is the degree of sophistication that the retail investor has had. Does he or she understand everything about the information that I am providing them with? And therefore, are they capable of making a sophisticated decision to buy or sell or hold shares in our company? That has always been the inherent challenge. There are other challenges in dealing with different types of investors, but as it relates to the flow of information and IR, that's what really drives it all. So to make the retail investor more comfortable, the real task is to create information flows that are not intimidating. So getting 100-page dry document 4 times a year can be quite intimidating for many different types of audience members. The question then is, how do you simplify that information without being misleading, without straying from its purpose, and yet making it more approachable for the retail investor? Well, turning it into an audio product that is a manageable experience, that is not necessarily replacing the written document, but supplementing the written document, is something that would be really helpful to the retail investor, because all the retail investor is looking for is education and the ability to have all the tools with which to make a well-informed decision. And that is where audio can then play a very friendly role to the retail investor.
What would you say are the most common mistakes that companies make when communicating to a retail audience?
When you talk to a retail audience, you want to be careful to avoid certain mistakes. And certainly some of the mistakes that I've seen over the years, originally in the finance world and more recently through the work at Audi in leading the Campfire product, I would say the number one mistake that companies make is they think that the retail investor is less important than the institutional investor. And they think that the retail investor is somehow more naive or can be dealt with in a more simplistic way than an institutional investor. There are some really interesting platforms out there that are so-called crowdfunding platforms, particularly in the UK, where a less sophisticated investor is allowed to buy shares in private companies. The leadership of those private companies who use crowdfunding as a way to raise capital from investors can be a real minefield. And there are plenty of stories where the leadership of private companies don't do enough to accurately or correctly manage their relationship with folks who are buying shares in a private company through a crowdfunding platform. That shortcoming can have a trickle-down effect into the public company talking to retail investors. So somehow thinking that the retail investor is less important, doesn't need to be given the same attention as an institutional investor. But the truth is, whoever is buying shares in your company, they have rights, and they have the right to be protected by law, and they have particularly the right to be protected by law when the company treats them inferior to institutional investors or other larger investors. So it's really important that companies avoid what I think is a most common mistake, which is to treat the retail investor as an inferior category of investor.
So on a similar note, does this messaging need to be presented differently, such as being less sophisticated for speaking to retail investors? Or how should issuers simplify some of this more complex information without dumbing it down?
When you think about communicating with a retail audience, having taken into account a number of the observations I've made, a key question you would ask yourself is, do I need to talk to them in a way that is different than talking to an institutional investor? Well, the answer to that actually is quite complex. An institutional investor, by definition, is assumed to be a sophisticated or accredited investor who is capable of understanding completely the risks associated with buying a particular security or shares in a quoted company. And with a retail investor, that assumption is less obvious in terms of it being a given. And so a company has to go to a greater level of effort to make sure that a retail investor understands the risks in investing in their company's securities, because there isn't that same level of assumption that they have the same skill set or knowledge that an institutional investor has. So the message or the information that flows to a retail investor needs to be emphasizing of the risks associated with the investment, and there needs to be clarity at all times to ensure that the audience is capable of understanding what you are discussing or writing about in packaging your information.
Can you share any examples of companies engaging retail investors effectively?
So when you think about companies that deal a lot with retail investors, they are typically companies that are prepared for the legal difference between talking to a retail investor and talking to an institutional investor. So their explanations are robust. They're detailing in a clear and simple way of all of the risks associated with investing in their company are successfully implemented. Their use of content, whether that is video-based, audio-based, by whatever channel they have in mind, they are effective in that content strategy. It is worth remembering that the difference between a retail investor and an institutional investor sometimes can be that a retail investor makes more of an emotional decision. So they are connecting to the brand of a public company, not merely to the financial information or the granular details, right? So it might be the case that a company like Apple or Tesla or the Walt Disney Company, these are good examples of public companies that have extremely strong brands in the eyes and minds of retail investors, and who might be driven more by emotional decision-making than by pure analysis and research. So making sure these companies are very good at trying to make sure that retail investors really understand what it is they're buying when they buy shares in that company. So I would say for the most part, it's companies that have a good consumer brand that are very exceptional at being able to communicate their IR with the retail community.
If you could give one piece of advice to investor relations leaders trying to build trust with retail investors, what would that be?
So, if you are going to talk to the retail investor, what sort of relationship do you really need to build? You're obviously trying to build trust. You're trying to get your integrity and your authenticity to come across. I think the key thing is to not talk down to retail investors, to talk clearly, to talk about your prospects in a legally astute but clear manner, and to make sure that the flow of information is easy to understand, it's clear, and it resonates so that the end user is able to understand everything about your business and is therefore able to make an informed decision. This has been Campfire Academy, an Audi production. To learn more about how you can capture investor attention and stay top of mind, visit audi.com.